It was one of those grey October mornings that England does so well, not raining, not quite sunny, just sitting in that in-between place where the light feels undecided about everything. The kind of morning that makes the countryside look like a painting that hasn't been finished yet. I was standing near the stone wall along the edge of the Gatcombe Park estate. Not inside, of course. Nobody just walks onto that land. But there's a narrow public footpath that runs along the perimeter, a gravel track worn thin by dog walkers and the occasional curious visitor who's heard the name and just wants to say they stood near it. I was one of those people that morning. A journalist, technically. But really just someone who'd followed a rumor down a very long, very muddy road. The estate itself is in Gloucestershire, tucked between the rolling hills, like it was placed there deliberately, privately, like whoever chose this land didn't want to be found easily. And, for decades, that's exactly what it gave the royal family, specifically Princess Anne. Privacy. Space. A life that didn't feel like a performance. I'd heard something the evening before. A contact, someone who works in a peripheral role near the royal household, the kind of person who sees things and says nothing publicly but, sometimes, just sometimes, sends a text message at 10:30 at night with no context, had reached out. The message was simple. 3 sentences. Something happened at Gatcombe today. A visit. Not a normal one. That was it. No name. No detail. Just that quiet urgency that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up because you just know that there's a real story underneath. So I came. Drove 2.5 hours from London, stopped once for a terrible service station coffee that tasted like warm disappointment, and arrived at the edge of Gatcombe Park just as the morning mist was starting to lift off the fields. There were maybe 4 or 5 other people on that footpath. An older man with a chocolate Labrador who didn't look up once. A young couple taking photographs of the trees. A woman in a green wax jacket who walked with the confidence of someone who did this every single day and wasn't here for anything unusual. And then, there was me, slightly overdressed for the countryside in my London coat, notebook tucked under my arm, standing very still and watching the main access lane that curves up toward the house. The house itself is Georgian, solid, unpretentious by royal standards. No gold gates. No fountains. Just old stone, tall windows, and the kind of stillness that real money buys, not flash, not show, just permanence. And had always made it feel that way. Hers. Completely and unapologetically hers. Which is why what happened over the next 24 hours felt so extraordinary. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not to that morning on the footpath. Further back. Because to understand what happened at Gatcombe Park, what it meant, why it hit Camilla the way it did, why even people inside the palace were apparently caught off guard, you have to understand the women involved. All 3 of them. And the Princess Royal. 83 years old now. The second child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. The one who has never, in her entire public life, been caught doing something simply because it was expected of her. She was the first British royal to compete in the Olympics. She survived an attempted kidnapping in 1974 with such composure that the story almost sounds like fiction. She has driven herself to engagements, carried her own bags, refused unnecessary security for years, and spoken in that particular tone, direct, slightly impatient with theater that makes you feel like you should just get to the point. She never became queen. Never came particularly close to the center of things, at least not in the way that the media spotlight tends to demand. And she seemed, always, genuinely fine with that. Maybe more than fine. There was something about and that suggested she had made her peace with the role very early on, and that her definition of a life well lived had very little to do with proximity to the throne. Gatcombe Park was her anchor. She purchased it in 1976, well, it was purchased for her, a gift from the Queen, and she made it into a working farm. Horses. Land. A real estate, not a decorative one. Her children grew up there. Her routines were built there. After her first marriage ended and she remarried, Gatcombe remained constant. The one thing that was simply, fully hers. Then, there is Catherine. Princess of Wales. The woman who has, over the past decade and a half, transformed herself from a young woman blinking nervously in the flashbulbs into someone that a significant portion of this country looks at with genuine, not manufactured, not obligated affection. She nearly broke publicly in those years when everything in her private life was fracturing at the edges. But she held. She came back, steadier somehow, and people saw it and felt it. She and have never had what you'd call a warm public dynamic. Not cold either. More like two people who respect each other from a careful distance. And does not do warmth easily. Catherine has learned not to push. But, somewhere, quietly, something shifted. And, then, there is Camilla. Queen Camilla now. The woman whose journey from public villain to queen consort to queen is one of the most complicated arcs in modern royal history. She has earned her place, if earning means simply surviving long enough, adapting well enough, smiling through enough public appearances until the country adjusted its feelings. And, the country mostly did adjust. Mostly. But, Camilla and Catherine have never been simple. There is a politeness between them that is slightly too polished. A warmth that is performed with just a little too much effort. Anyone who has watched them together in public really watched, not just glanced, has felt it. Two women navigating the same institution from positions that require them to be allies and that have never quite made it easy to actually be friends. When my contact sent me that message, I didn't immediately think of all three of them. But, standing there at the edge of Gatcombe Park in the October fog, I started to. Because there was something in the air that morning. Something that felt like aftermath. Like I had arrived just after something large and irreversible had already happened, and all I could do now was stand in the echo of it. The Labrador man walked past me again, nodded. I nodded back. Normal. Ordinary. And then, a dark car moved slowly down the access lane toward the house, and even from that distance, I could see the small flag on the bonnet. Not ends. Different. I checked my watch. 8:30 in the morning. I reached for my notebook. The rumor had been building for weeks before my contact reached out, if you knew where to look. Not in the newspapers, nowhere official, nowhere you could point to and say there, that's the story. But, in the particular silence that surrounds things that haven't been confirmed yet. The way certain sources suddenly stop talking. The way a subject that was previously unremarkable, the future of certain royal properties, specifically the question of what happens to private estates that sit in that complicated space between personal ownership and institutional expectation, started coming up in conversations that weren't really about that at all. Royal properties are a strange category. Some belong to the crown directly, Balmoral, Sandringham, and their futures are essentially decided by institutional tradition. Others, like Gatcombe, exist in a different legal space. Purchased privately. Owned privately. Which means, theoretically, the person who owns them can decide what becomes of them. I didn't know, standing there on that footpath, what I was about to find out. But, I knew I was standing near the epicenter of something. The car disappeared up the lane. A light came on in one of the upper windows of the house. I pulled my coat tighter and waited. It was almost 2 hours later. I'd gone through the rest of my coffee thermos and written approximately nothing useful in my notebook when I saw the second car arrive. And then, about 15 minutes after that, a third. And, with the third car came a small detail that made my heart do a very specific journalist thing, which is to beat slightly faster and more quietly at the same time. The woman who stepped out of the third car. I recognized the coat first, a particular shade of navy that had been photographed at an event 3 weeks earlier. And, then, the posture. And, then, the face, even at that distance. Catherine. Princess of Wales. At Gatcombe Park. On a Tuesday morning. Without any advance press notice, without any public engagement listed on the court circular, without any of the careful pre-announcement that royal visits typically involve. I wrote one word in my notebook and underlined it 3 times. Why? What I didn't know yet, what I would piece together over the following hours and days from sources who spoke carefully, from documents that were shared quietly, from conversations held in the particular register of people who understand that what they're saying is significant, was that inside that house, at that moment, a conversation was taking place that people would still be talking about years from now. And had made a decision. A real one. The kind that doesn't get reversed. And it concerned Gatcombe Park. All of it. The house, the estate, the land, the history soaked into every stone of it. The place she had built her private life around for nearly 50 years. She was giving it to Catherine. Not in the distant future. Not as some clause buried in a legal document that would surface after a death. Now. A living transfer. A deliberate, considered, unambiguous gift from one woman to another, from the Princess Royal to the Princess of Wales. And nobody, not the institution, not the advisors, not the people who believe it is their professional function to know these things before they happen, had seen it coming. Including Camilla. Especially Camilla. I didn't have all of this yet, standing at that stone wall. But I had enough. I had the cars. I had the flag. I had Catherine's coat. I had my contact's 3 sentences vibrating in my memory. And I had the absolute certainty, the kind that sits in your chest rather than your head, that whatever was happening inside that grey Georgian house on that October morning was not small. I stayed on the footpath until nearly noon. The Labrador man came around a third time, and this time he stopped and looked at me properly, a little suspicious, a little curious. "You a journalist?" he said. I said yes. He looked at the house. Then, back at me. Then, he whistled for his dog and walked on without another word. I took that as some kind of answer. The call came at 3:15 that afternoon. I was sitting in the car park of a pub about a mile from Gatcombe, eating a sandwich I hadn't tasted and replying to emails I hadn't read properly, when my phone buzzed against the dashboard and the name on the screen made me set the sandwich down immediately. She works in a support role for one of the royal households, I won't say which, I won't say more than that. She has never given me anything inaccurate. Not once in 6 years. She speaks in a very measured way, the way people do when they've trained themselves to say exactly as much as they intend to say and absolutely nothing more. She said, "You're in Gloucestershire." Not a question. "Yes," I said. A pause. The kind that means something is being decided on the other end of the line. "You'll want to stay," she said. "Something has been signed." I waited. "And has transferred Gatcombe." "Formally." "Papers were witnessed this morning." "Catherine was there." "A solicitor was there." Another pause. "It's done." I asked, "Does the palace know?" And she said something I haven't stopped thinking about since. The palace knew after. 3 words. After. Not before. Not during. After. Meaning that one of the most significant private property decisions in the recent history of the royal family had been made by Princess and executed, completed, and, only then, communicated to the institutional machinery that would normally expect to have some influence over something like this. And had done it her way. Of course she had. She'd always done everything her way. I asked if Camilla knew. The pause that followed was slightly longer than the others. She was informed this afternoon. How did she react? That, she said, is not something I'm going to tell you. She hung up. I sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then, I started the car and drove back toward Gatcombe. To understand why this decision landed the way it did, why it sent the particular kind of tremor through certain corridors, you have to understand what Gatcombe represents. Not just to Anne. To the broader architecture of the royal family's emotional geography. Royal estates are not just properties. They're statements. They're declarations of who belongs where, of whose roots go deepest, of who has earned permanence within an institution that places enormous symbolic weight on exactly these questions. When a member of the royal family holds a significant private estate, it means something. When they pass it on, to whom they pass it on means even more. Camilla, in her role as queen, has been carefully, deliberately building something. Not just a public image, though that too, but a position. An influence. A sense, within the family and within the institution, that she is not simply the king's wife but a genuine presence, a matriarch of sorts, someone whose voice carries weight in the quiet rooms where things are actually decided. It has been slow work. Patient work. The kind of long game that requires consistency and the careful management of relationships. Her relationship with Catherine has always been the complicated piece of that puzzle. Not hostile. Nothing so obvious. More like two chess players who are technically on the same board but are not entirely sure whose side the other is on. There is mutual awareness between them. A recognition of each other's intelligence, each other's capability, the particular stubbornness that both of them carry beneath their very different public surfaces. What Camilla needed, in the quiet of her own calculations, was for the geography of influence within the family to remain somewhat predictable. For alliances to stay where she had mapped them. For surprises to be minimal. And granting Gatcombe to Catherine was not minimal. It was, in fact, the kind of move that rearranges the map entirely. Because here is what it meant, what people inside these circles understood it to mean, even if they would never say so directly, and the Princess Royal, the elder stateswoman of this family, the woman whose opinion carries the particular authority of someone who has earned it rather than inherited it, had chosen Catherine. Had said, in the most material, most permanent, most undeniable way possible, this woman matters. This woman is worth investing in. This woman is where I am placing my trust. That is not a small thing. That is not a gesture. That is an alignment. And, Camilla, being as sharp as she is, understood it immediately. I managed to speak to someone else that afternoon. He was peripheral to the whole business, not present for the signing, not part of the immediate circle, but he knew people who were, and he was willing to talk more freely than my earlier contact. We met in the car park of a farm shop about 4 miles from Gatcombe. He was wearing a barber jacket and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, which in my experience means someone who has information they want to share but are not entirely at peace with sharing it. He told me the visit had been planned for weeks. Not weeks of back and forth negotiation, weeks of simply having made up her mind and then arranging the practical elements. The solicitor. The witnesses. The timing. She had told Catherine approximately a month before. Had called her directly, he said, not through staff, not through intermediaries. Directly. And Catherine had apparently been so taken aback that she'd said very little on the call and had needed to ring in back the following day after she'd had time to process it properly. She tried to decline, he said. Catherine. She said it was too much. What didn't say? He almost smiled. And told her that declining wasn't an option she was offering. That sounded exactly right. That sounded so entirely like and that I almost laughed. He told me that the morning meeting had been quiet. Just the three of them and Catherine, and the solicitor, plus 2 witnesses from the estate staff who had been there for decades and were, presumably, capable of extraordinary discretion. No photographers. No announcement. Just the business of it, done in the plain, efficient way that and does everything. How did Catherine seem? I asked. He thought about this for a moment. Emotional, I think. Trying not to show it. She kept looking around the room at the furniture, the windows, like she was trying to memorize it. Or trying to make it real. That image stayed with me. Catherine standing in Anne's house, looking at the walls, trying to understand that it was now, somehow, impossibly, going to be hers. And, Anne? Normal, he said. Completely normal. Made tea at some point. Asked about the children. He paused. That's Anne, isn't it? She does the most extraordinary thing and, then, makes tea. The question that everyone was asking in the hours after it became known among those who needed to know was simple. Why? Why now? Why Catherine? Why this? The answers, depending on who you spoke to, varied. Some of them were practical. Anne is not young. The estate requires a future, a plan. Her own children have their lives, their directions. And Gatcombe, given its history, its association with the active, working, unpretentious side of royal life that Anne has always embodied, needed someone who would carry that forward with the same seriousness. Catherine, who has rebuilt her public identity around exactly those qualities, diligence, sincerity, the willingness to work hard at things that actually matter, was, in that reading, the obvious choice. Not because of sentiment. Because of fit. But there were other readings too. Older, quieter ones. Anne has watched Catherine for 15 years. Has watched her navigate an institution that is not always kind to the people who enter it. Has watched her stumble and recover and stumble again and recover again. And, somewhere in that watching, it seems, based on everything my contacts told me, based on the accumulated evidence of small moments that don't make the news, and had arrived at a conclusion. She trusted her. Not just liked. Not just approved. Trusted. Which for Anne is an entirely different register. Anne's trust is not easily given and, once given, is not symbolic. It means something. It comes with weight behind it. And there was, perhaps, one more element. One that nobody said directly but that sat underneath several of my conversations like something submerged just below the surface. And has watched the dynamics within this family shift, over the past several years, in ways that were not always comfortable for her. She has watched Camilla's influence grow. She has watched Catherine navigate that particular challenge with what appears to be grace, but what those close to Catherine know has sometimes been genuine difficulty. She has observed, from her careful distance, the topology of power within the institution. And, perhaps, this is my reading, my interpretation, based on everything I gathered, she decided to do something about it. In the most way possible. Not with a statement. Not with a public gesture. With land. With Gatcombe Park. With 50 years of herself. The news reached Camilla, according to what I was told, through official channels in the early afternoon. A call from a senior aide, who had been informed by the solicitor's office, who had formally notified the relevant parties as part of the legal process of the transfer. She was at Windsor when she found out. That's what I was told. In a private sitting room, mid-afternoon. The call lasted approximately 8 minutes. What happened in those 8 minutes, what was said, how she responded in the immediate privacy of that room before she composed herself back into Queen Camilla, I don't know. I won't pretend to know. But, I know this, by evening, she had made 2 calls of her own. The nature and recipients of those calls were described to me only obliquely, in the way that people describe things they want you to understand without wanting to have explicitly said them. One call was to someone within the family. One was to a senior advisor. Neither call, I was told, was brief. And neither of them changed anything. Because there was nothing to change. The papers had been signed. The solicitor had filed the necessary documents. Gatcombe Park now belonged to Catherine, Princess of Wales, as surely and as legally as the laws of England could make it so. Anne had moved. And the move was complete. I drove back past the estate as the light was failing, that particular dusk that turns the Gloucestershire hills into something from a dream, purple and gold and grey all at once. The house was lit from inside, warm rectangles of light in the tall windows. I could see the silhouette of a figure moving in one of the ground floor rooms. I don't know who it was. I stopped the car for a moment on the lane. Just sat there, engine running. There is something about being physically present at a place where something significant has happened. The place doesn't change. The stones don't shift. The trees don't rearrange themselves to mark the occasion. And, yet it feels different. Or maybe you just look at it differently, knowing what you now know. Gatcombe Park. A working estate in Gloucestershire. Georgian house, old stone, hills on every side. For nearly 50 years, Anne's. And, now, as of this grey October morning, quietly, deliberately, unmistakably, Catherine's. I put the car in gear and drove toward the motorway. I had a story to write. 3 days passed before anything appeared publicly. 3 days in which I sat on what I knew, partly because the story needed more confirmation, more texture, more of the human detail that separates a real account from a rushed one, and partly because there is a particular discipline required in this kind of work, a patience that goes against every instinct but is almost always worth it. In those 3 days, I made more calls, sent more messages, drove back to Gloucestershire once more on the Thursday, when the weather had turned properly cold and the fields on either side of the road were white with frost, the kind of hard, bright cold that makes everything feel very clear and very still. I wanted to see the estate in a different light. Not because I needed more material, I had more than enough, but because sometimes understanding a story properly requires living inside it for a few days longer. Sitting with it. Letting it settle into something you can actually hold. What I was processing, slowly, over those 3 days, was not just the news itself. It was the layers underneath the news. And there were several. The first layer was the most practical. The legal transfer of Gatcombe Park from Anne to Catherine represented, in straightforward terms, a significant shift in the distribution of significant private royal property. Estimates of the estate's value, the house, the farm buildings, the hundreds of acres of land, put it well into the tens of millions. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was real. This had weight in the literal, material sense of the word. It also had implications for how Catherine's future, particularly in the context of what her life might look like in various possible futures, including futures that none of us like to think about directly, would be structured. Gatcombe gave her something that no amount of royal protocol could provide, an independent foothold. Land that was hers. Not the Crown's. Not the institutions. Hers personally, with all the security and the privacy and the permanence that entailed. And, having spent nearly 50 years building exactly that kind of life for herself, knew precisely what she was giving. The second layer was about relationships. And this one was harder to articulate cleanly, because it lived in the space between the explicit and the implicit, the space where most of the real life of this family actually happens. And Catherine had never been publicly close. That's the record. The photographs, the joint engagements, the interactions captured on camera, they are polite, professionally warm, marked by mutual respect but not by the kind of visible ease that signals genuine intimacy. They come from different worlds, different generations, different ways of being. Anne's directness has always been slightly daunting. Catherine's warmth has always been slightly outside Anne's comfort zone. And yet something had built between them. Quietly, consistently, over years. People who have observed them in private, genuinely private, not the performatively private moments that still end up photographed, describe something different from the public record. A real conversation between them, apparently, rather than the managed exchange. And asking questions and actually listening to the answers. Catherine speaking more directly to and than she does to most people. A mutual recognition that, underneath the very different surfaces, there is something each of them values in the other. And values capability. She values people who do the work rather than perform it. She values not being handled. Catherine, over the years, stopped trying to handle and stopped arriving with the polished diplomatic approach that works with most people and started simply being direct with her instead. And, apparently, slowly, that changed things. The transfer of Gatcombe was the ultimate expression of that changed thing. It was in saying, not with words, not with a speech, not with any of the trappings of sentiment, I see you. I trust you. I'm giving you the most real thing I have. That is not a small sentence. The third layer. This one kept pulling me back, over those 3 days, more than any other. Camilla. I want to be fair about this. I want to be careful, because it's too easy, to frame this story in a way that positions Camilla as a villain, as someone who deserved the shock, who had something coming to her. That's not the story I'm telling. That's not what I think is true. Camilla is a complicated woman who has navigated a genuinely complicated situation with more skill and more resilience than she is often credited for. The public image has softened over the years, but there are still people who have never fully forgiven her, who hold on to their feelings about her with a grip that has nothing to do with who she actually is and everything to do with who she came to represent in a story they told themselves about Diana. That is not justice. It is not accurate. But Camilla does have a way of operating that is, let me find the right word, possessive is not quite it. Territorial is too aggressive. Say, protective of the arrangements she has built. Protective of the equilibrium she has carefully established within the family. She is a woman who likes to know how things stand. Who finds comfort in predictability. Who has worked very hard to ensure that her position, her influence, the respect she has earned, are not easily disturbed. And giving Gatcombe to Catherine disturbed it. Not because it was a direct attack, it wasn't that, and I don't think Anne intended it as one. But because it demonstrated something that Camilla would have preferred to be less demonstrated. Namely, that there are alliances within this family that exist outside of her influence. That there are decisions being made that she cannot shape. That Catherine, who Camilla has, I think, genuinely underestimated at various points, has a kind of capital, a kind of standing, that does not depend on Camilla's goodwill. That is what the 8-minute phone call was processing, I suspect. That is what the 2 follow-up calls were about. Not a plan to reverse the situation, there was no reversing it, but the internal recalibration that happens when someone is capable as Camilla realizes that the map is different from what she thought. I spoke, on the Friday, to someone who had worked in a household adjacent to Camilla's for several years and who now does not. The conversation happened over coffee in a very ordinary cafe in central London, chosen specifically for its anonymity, the kind of place where nobody looks at each other, where the background noise covers everything, where 2 people can talk without being watched. She said, of Camilla, she'll be fine. She always is. She adapts. I asked whether she thought Camilla had seen any of this coming. Any indication that Anne was moving in this direction. No, she said, without hesitation. Anne is very good at not giving things away before she's ready. A pause. Actually, I think that might be one of the things Anne respects about Catherine too. She's learned to be the same. I asked what she thought Catherine would do with Gatcombe. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and thought about it for a moment. Use it properly. Not as a showpiece. As a place. Another pause. She'll make it a home. She does that with things. She takes difficult things and makes them into homes. That sentence stayed with me. It felt true in a way that was hard to articulate precisely but easy to feel. On the Saturday, 5 days after the signing, a brief statement was released. Not from Buckingham Palace. From Kensington Palace, which is Catherine's office. It confirmed the transfer in the most understated language possible, a gift from the Princess Royal to the Princess of Wales, made privately, reflecting the deep personal regard between them. It thanked Princess Anne for her generosity and spoke of Gatcombe's significance as an estate with a long and proud history. 17 sentences. Almost no detail. Very deliberate. The response was immediate and widespread. Social media, newspapers, the commentary from people who follow these things professionally and the millions who follow them personally. Most of it was warmly, genuinely positive toward both Anne and Catherine. Some of it was more pointed pieces that asked the questions I'd been sitting with for 5 days, about what this meant for the family's internal dynamics, about the relationship between Catherine and Camilla, about what it signals when the Princess Royal makes this kind of choice. Buckingham Palace released nothing of its own that day. Camilla made one public appearance, that Saturday afternoon, at a charity event in Kensington. She was photographed arriving and leaving. In the photographs, she looks composed, engaged, every inch the queen she has worked so hard to become. The expression on her face tells you nothing. That too, I think, is its own kind of statement. That degree of composure, in that moment, does not come for free. It is achieved. Deliberately. With effort. She is good at this, Camilla. Say that plainly. She is very, very good at this. I went back to Gloucestershire one final time. A week after the morning on the footpath. The weather had changed entirely by then, one of those rare October reversals where the warmth comes back unexpectedly, genuinely warm in the afternoons, the light falling golden across the fields in a way that makes everything look like a different country from the grey of the week before. I walked the footpath again. Same gravel under my boots, same stone wall, same view across to the house. But the house felt different now, though nothing visible had changed. Or maybe I was the one who was different. Maybe that's how it always works, the place stays still and you shift inside it. There was a new detail I hadn't noticed the first time. Or maybe it simply hadn't been there. Along the fence line near the eastern gate, someone had placed a small bunch of flowers. Wildflowers, tied with string, leaned against the stone. Not fresh, a few days old, slightly wilted, the stems browning at the bottom. Nothing with them. No note that I could see. Just the flowers, put there by someone who had felt some need to mark the moment. I stood looking at them for a while. I'm not sure why. They were probably nothing. People leave things like this all over the countryside for all sorts of reasons. But, in that moment, in that particular golden light, they felt like they meant something. Like they were someone's quiet way of saying, this mattered. Whatever just happened here, this mattered. I took a photograph of them and, then, put my phone away. There is a thing that happens when you follow a story long enough and, close enough, where it stops being purely professional. Where you stop being the observer and become someone who is genuinely invested in the human meaning of what you've witnessed. I know that this is supposed to be a problem in journalism, attachment, investment, the loss of distance. And maybe it is a problem, sometimes. But sometimes it's just the truth of it. Sometimes the story is about people, real ones, and, to understand it properly you have to let yourself actually feel what it is they've experienced. What I kept coming back to, across all of it, was not the power dynamics. Not the property values. Not the institutional implications, the palace communication strategies, the ripple effect on public perception. It was a simpler image than all of that. And, in her house, making tea. Having done the most significant thing she could do for another person in her position, having transferred the most permanent expression of her private self, and, then, doing what she always does, being practical, being present, being completely unsentimental about what was actually a profoundly sentimental act. And, Catherine, across the room from her, looking at the walls and the windows and trying to make it real. Trying to find the edges of what she'd been given. Not the property, the trust. The declaration. The choosing. Women like and don't do things by accident. Every decision she has made across 83 years has been considered. Gatcombe Park was her most considered thing. She chose Catherine. She chose her plainly and permanently. And, in doing so, she reminded everyone, Camilla, the palace, the watchers, the commentators, the people who think they understand this family, that the old certainties are not as fixed as they appear. That the people who have been quiet are not without agency. That beneath the surface of public royal life, with all its ceremony and its choreography, there are real women making real choices about who they trust and who they stand behind. And stood behind Catherine. That's the story. Simple as that. Complex as that. I drove home from Gloucestershire on a Saturday evening, the motorway lit orange in the dusk, the radio murmuring something I didn't really listen to. My notebook was full of things I'd written and crossed out and rewritten. My phone had 17 unread messages from people who'd seen the Kensington Palace statement and wanted to know what I knew. I turned the radio off and drove in silence for a while. Thought about the wildflowers on the fence. Thought about the Labrador man who'd looked at me and walked away without a word. Thought about Catherine in that room, looking at the windows. And I thought about something my source had said on that very first call, the one at 3:15, the 8 words that had sent me back toward Gatcombe in the fading afternoon. She'd said, something has been signed. And I'd heard it as news. As a story. As information. But, sitting in the car on the motorway, a week later, I heard it differently. Something has been signed. Something permanent. Something that says, I choose you. Something that cannot be taken back. Not just property on paper. Something much older and much more human than that. The gesture that says, here is what I have. Here is what I've built. Here is everything I made of my private life, every stone and every field and every morning. I'm putting it in your hands. There are not many moments in a life where someone does that for you. Not many people who trust you that much. And, when it happens, when someone with everything to lose and nothing to prove makes that kind of choice, without fanfare, without expectation, without needing anything in return, it changes things. It changed things at Gatcombe Park on a grey October Tuesday. And, for Catherine, standing in that room, looking at those windows, trying to find the edges of what she'd been given, it probably changed everything.